Netflix, available in over 190 countries, home to some of our favorite shows, like these. It's too many! I had a lot of fun building out the Disney Plus homepage in a previous video, so I thought I would try to attempt to build the Netflix one. So I grabbed my computer and played around for a bit, and soon enough, I figured it out. So in this video, I'll walk you through my thought process. Here's the finished product right now. It's got a nice homepage here with a loading screen, all the different profile divs that you can click on to enter the site. It's got the navigation bar with some drop-down divs, different profiles, video backgrounds, hover elements with video elements, backgrounds, all these fun things for each of the shows. So let's Netflix and chill together and work out some Webflow. So I have my body and I'm going to add a big div here. I'm just going to call this an overlay div, and I'm going to make the height 100% so it takes up the full width of the screen, height and width. I'm going to make the position relative because we're going to need to position some things with inside it. So this is going to be where the profile divs live in the beginning, those little icons with all the faces. So this is just going to be the holder screen, and we'll have it fade out once we're ready to enter the main site. So I'm going to start by putting the Netflix logo in there, given the top right there, and positioning it to the top left of its parent container. Give it position absolute so it stays in the top left. And next I'm going to add a container just to keep all our things centered and nicely in the middle. I'll give it a background color so we can see what we're working with as we do this. And it looks really tiny for now, but it's going to grow once we put some things inside it. I'll add this heading. It's just going to be the who's watching title, make it a nice H1 so it's the prominent thing on the page. Give it some unitless line height as well, 1.4 dash, nice trick. All right, and now we can make this 2 or 4 VW, this width, and that way it scales nicely with the screen size, 4% of the viewport width. Now I'm going to add another div in here. This is going to be where our profile containers actually live. And I'll just make the width of this 20% because each of these items, we're going to have 5 of them. So 5 times 20% is 100% of its parent container. So if they all have a width of 20%, they will nicely distribute themselves with inside the container we're building right now. So we've got a beautiful Anthony from Queer Eye. He's going to be our first profile selection. Give it a little border radius. Got this heading. It's going to have the name of the person who's trying to view it. I'll get rid of that background color because now we can see more clearly what we're working with here. Just give some subtle styling to this. And now you'll see I flexed both of those things. So now the image sits on top and the text sits beneath. Flex vertical there. I'm going to give it a little hover state as well. So we've got the nice border radius. And I want to make sure that that white border is on hover. So I'll just make sure it's a few pixel border on hover. But I also want to affect the name beneath, right? Because the name is also going to brighten up when you hover over the profile picture. So this I have to use an interaction for because I'm hovering over one element, but I'm targeting another element. So when I go to interactions, I can just target the Anthony div and then make sure the Anthony name is what brightens in the color. So I'm just changing its base state from the gray initially to the white. And then I want to make sure I do the reverse when we hover out of the object. So basically I can just duplicate the one we just made and then just delete one of the values, so then it's returning right back to the gray state it was. There we go, nice and smooth. Beautiful. Now with the interaction set up on this element, I'm going to make sure, well, now we added a pointer, great, like makes it look clickable. Now I can just copy the Anthony and just put them inside the parent container. Make it flex instead so that they all live side by side. And now I've got all of these with the same styling and hover effects. If you have a lot of things that are going to behave the same way, it's best to build one and then just copy it because that way it absorbs all the same styling. And then you can just individually change out the specifics. So the image and the profile name, you can just swap all those out. I love Cheryl the robot from Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt. If you ever saw it, it's so funny. It's such a subtle random character. All right, so we got all those hover effects going. I'll text center this. Great, coming together. And we just need one more because we're going to have that add profile div on the end, right? So this one will just behave a little bit differently. It doesn't have a picture there. It's going to just have the plus icon instead. And when we hover on this one, we want to make sure the background color fills in, so we can target the div there for that. So I'll just make sure the initial state is the transparent, and then once the duration is complete on the hover, I'll just make it that white color so it looks like they're hovering in. And I'll do the reverse for the hover out, make sure they switch so it goes back to transparent. There we go, each one has the hover icon, and then this one fills in by itself. Beautiful. And we just got to attach the name, change this, add profile, and just add that to the interaction we just made. Make sure that the name is also changing colors just like we did earlier. Great. And then hover out, make sure it goes back to gray. Make sure they happen at the same time. And ease those, save, and there we go. So let's add some padding to this, make sure it's a little bit smaller screens. It's always a little indented on the sides. Here we go, and you see that our title, who's watching, does scale nicely as well. I'm not going to go through and make this fully responsive just for the desktop view, but viewport width is always a very handy font size to use. Alright, so now we want to make sure when we click these, it brings us into the site. So I'm going to make all of these divs clickable and have the same interaction. So any of these profile divs will make them clickable and add an interaction so it takes us in. So when I click this, I want the main overlay div, so this whole black screen that we're looking at, the profiles, I want that to fade out and then display none, so then we can go inside of the main content from the next page. So first I'll affect the base states and tell it the opacity should be 100 on start, and it should be displayed flex on start, and then I want to make sure it fades out first, and then the actual element displays none, because we don't want it to disappear while we're watching it disappear. We want it opacity first, and then the hide show to none. Perfect, nice and smooth. So now when we click these, there we go, it fades out. But it only works on Antony, so we got to make sure we change that from the selected element, so this interaction applies to every class with this, because they all have the same class, right? So now it works when we click Antony, fades out. When we click Crush, perfect, and Colony. So now because they all have the same class, we can apply this interaction to each of those. Great. So now let's display this none so we can just see the next page that we're building out here. And because in the interaction, the initial state is set to display flex and opacity is 100, we're still going to see it when we are on our website. But for building designing purposes, we can hit display none right now so we can see what we're working with. So for the nav bar, I'm just going to add a div block on top. I don't want to use the nav bar element because I'm not going to follow the same structure really that the Webflow nav bar element does. I'll just make it a div block and kind of build my own. I'm going to add the Netflix logo image in there again. Give it a set width and some margin. Then I can affect the container itself for the div and just add some padding so everything lives nicely inside. I'm going to add another div block. This is going to hold the nav links. So I'll just make the little container here and use a link block. If you do have things that are clickable, it is always nice to use link blocks themselves. Don't just use a text and then add a click kind of element to it. If it's an actual link block in the HTML behind the scenes, it's better for SEO purposes, and Google knows that this is an actual clickable link. It's not just some piece of text that you applied some click settings to. So always try to use link blocks themselves, or text links, not link blocks. So all these are text links, and I'll just give them all the same class. That way when I style one of them, they all are affected. Make sure each of these correspond to what they are. Great, so now I'm just going to add a little hover effect on these, just to make them a little gray when you hover on. Make sure there's a transition set. So that way all of them, great, little hover interaction. And by default, text links already have the pointer set, so I don't need to set a cursor pointer. So now I'm going to set another div block here. This is going to hold our icons from the right for like the profile dropdowns. I set the margin left to auto, so that way it pushes itself all the way to the right and gives it some space between whatever content comes before it, which is the other nav links on the left. And now I'm just going to add some images in here. These are going to be the links, and I'm going to put an actual div here for the drop down, because right now the magnifying glass, that's its own thing. The DVD is going to be its own thing as well, but the notification one is going to be kind of things with inside each other, so I want to make sure that's a div in itself. So this will be the Nav Bar notification div, and I'm going to make this relative because I'm going to have something absolutely positioned inside it, so it needs that point of reference. First, I'm going to make this little dot, a little notification dot. So I'm making a little tiny div, giving it just 5 by 5 pixels, and giving that red color. Change the border radius to 50%, so it's a perfect circle. And because it's parent, that little div we made is relative, I can make this absolutely positioned on the top left. And now I'm going to add the actual bell image in here, so it actually looks like a notification. And I'll have that little red dot sitting on the top left of it there to indicate, hey, you've got a new notification. I'm going to do the same thing on the end here for the profile. I want to make sure there's a parent div container that's set to relative, because that's going to hold two icons. First it'll be Anthony again, because this is the one you're signed in with. Set some dimensions on this, give it a little subtle radius. And then make sure in this div box, a little triangle icon lives next to it. And this will be a little drop-down indication. We'll give it some rotation properties in a few. All right, so now I'm going to make the drop-down div itself. So this is where all those shows are going to live when the user hovers over this bell. I want another div to open, and it's going to contain that CMS with all the different shows saying new episodes of Grey's Anatomy, new episodes of this. So I need somewhere for that to live, right? So first I'm going to create this big div. I'm going to give it this background color so we can see what we're working with here first. And its parent is set to relative, so now I can absolutely position this to the bottom right, I believe, of the parent. And I'm going to add another div inside it, and I made it 200% of its parent container. That's what the height is. So when we set overflow scroll, like I just did there, so there's one big box, and that's set width, and then there's another div block inside of it, and that has 200% height. So that way it grows 200% of its parent container. So you'll see here, when we're looking at the live view, you're able to scroll. So you just change the overflow property of the parent to something we want. All right, so now we want to make sure we can populate that with some shows. Now, I didn't use CMS for all of this site because you're only limited without paying for an actual hosting plan for your site to 100 items, and I thought I would go over that, so I only use it for this little section here. But basically, I'm just creating a little collection list here. Great way to store data. I have some other videos on this if you aren't familiar with the CMS, but I'm just going to give it simple fields, a name, a timestamp, and then an image. And I have one of those, and we can just build it out here and attach the styling to it. So in this div, I'm going to add my collection list. I'm going to attach it to the thing we just made. Then I'm going to add div blocks. We have a sort of palette to work on. We've got to put this inside our collection item. And now, since we're working within our CMS, all of these things that we're building will be able to reference the data that we're creating in the CMS. So now I can attach text and images to whatever I want by using these purple elements here, because that's indicating I'm going to pull it from your CMS collection. So first I got an image from the image field, just setting some dimensions. Now I'm going to add another little container that holds the text, so that way I can flex this. Just make this a color again so we can see what we're working with. A little transparency. All right, so now I can flex that. Now there's an image with a div to the right of it, and inside that is where I will put all of the text. And the reason I do this is so I can then align the text on top of each other. Flexbox is also very important in terms of the little details of styling things above and next to each other. I also have another video on that. It's Harry Potter themed, always fun, so feel free to check that out. So now I'm going to grab the name field from my CMS and the timestamp, put those right next to each other. Make sure that's flexed vertical. Add some margin to this. Great, so we've got an item here. And I'm going to change these colors back around. This will look better once we have our hero section, that big video background in behind this, because then it'll just be kind of faded on top. So you'll see here, this is me after I added all the new fields. So I basically just did that Grey's Anatomy thing, and I made a bunch more in my CMS. And I want to sort this to what we created first. So that brings Grey's back first. You can go to the sort in the settings of your CMS. There we go. So each one is just, I styled the Grey's one, and then as long as I go to my CMS and add all the new details for other ones, it creates it just for me. So it's so easy. Beautiful. Now I'm going to add the animation that happens when somebody hovers over this. So I want to target the parent container. So the parent container is the box that holds the little red dot and the bell, right? The bell image. And then, but I want to, so when I'm hovering over that, that's what I'm affecting. But then I'm going to target the big div with all the TV shows in it. And I want to make sure that's not displayed initially. So I'm going to hide it, just like we did with our main screen. I'll have the hide show and the opacity set to 0 and none. And then when they hover over the bell div, I want it to kind of fade into view. And I also want this bell, or the little red dot, to fade out as well. So initially it's going to be set to 100% opacity, because you can see it as if you haven't looked at your notifications yet. And then when they hover over it and the menu opens, it's noticing that you have looked at them now. So I'm going to have the red dot fade out to 0% opacity. So that way you've cleared your notifications and you're all up to date. And for the reverse, the hover out, again, I just duplicated the interaction, and I'm going to delete the end goals and just have those initial ones back set, so that when you play it and hover out, it'll just return to what you had initially set. All right, so and you see how there's a big gap on the right side there? It's pushing away. That's not good. So we want to make sure that's pushed back there. And that's because it's recognizing this whole new section that we created, the main homepage div. So that's technically displayed even when we're going into our main preview on the homepage. So we want to make sure that this whole element is not displayed initially. So we go back to our homepage interaction, where we click on the profile pictures, and we had that whole screen fade out. Now I'm targeting the main homepage div that we were just building in, and I'm going to make sure that's not displayed initially, so that the only thing loaded in our document is this picture here with our profile divs. So I want to make sure that other page with the nav bar will be hidden initially, and then once we click on any of the pictures like Anthony, that first page fades out and then the next one fades in. There we go. So that way they're not both in the document flow and pushing against each other, because now we don't have that space on the right side. So it's just that page, and when you click, that one disappears and this one replaces it. So now it has all the space to live and be itself. All right, so now let's work on the drop-down div for the profiles. So we have all those different profiles. Again, I'm going to give this a little background color just so we can see what we're doing. And again, so our Anthony div is relative, so that way we can have this absolutely positioned drop-down. And I think I make a mistake here. I'll fix this a little later. It's just the spot where I positioned it. And you'll see it kind of collapses on itself, but I'll address it when we get there later. But again, it's going to be one kind of big parent div with smaller individual divs inside of it. And they're all going to have a profile image and then a name next to it. So it's almost a similar structure to the notification div that we just did with all the TV shows. So it's the image with a div next to it, and then I'm going to put a piece of text in there. All right, let's get rid of this background now. Now we have some structure in place. Give this a little border bottom as well to distinguish between each of the different sections. And you can lower the opacity of it, the color, so that way it's a little bit more muted and not as intense. I think I end up changing this later anyway. But for now, you see all the Anthonys, but we obviously don't want that many. They need to represent each of the profiles. And this one's not going to have an image because it's just going to be the Manage Profiles button. So I created a class that just has no underline, just to get rid of some of the sections where I didn't want the underline underneath. And I think I ended up applying that to all of them later, because it's really just supposed to be under, I think, Share or Manage Profiles. But now I added another div at the bottom of this drop-down div, and that's just going to be the settings div. So it's just another kind of chunk of content, a little different styling for the boring setting parts of your Netflix page. All right, now I want to add a little bit more interactions here. So I'm going to do the same thing with this hover effect. I'm going to target the Anthony div, and I want to make sure that I'm affecting the whole drop-down div. You see how it's just that light blue line at the top there? That's what I was talking about before when I said it kind of collapses on itself. It's not recognizing the height of it. And here's where I think I fixed the positioning. There we go. I had it absolutely positioned in the wrong spot, so it was kind of collapsing. But now it recognizes its parent and it's positioned in the bottom left, I believe. So I'm basically just making sure the div beneath Anthony will fade into view and hide show none when we hover over him. Let's move on to the next thing right now. It's going to make this background sort of teaser section for the main featured video. So I'm going to add another section, and I'm going to make it 80% of the viewport height for its height there. And I'm going to add this Grey's Anatomy logo inside here. Just make it 50% width, so it's nice and big, and I can flex the parent container so that it centers this. Great. Give it some margin padding so it lives in the center a little bit more. Next thing I'm going to add is the little paragraph, just the show description here. Let's change the flex direction here so they live on top of each other and not side by side. There we go, that scales nicely. And I set a max width on this paragraph here, so that way on smaller screens you'll see it shrinks, but it'll never be too wide, so it's not legible at all. Next I'm going to add a little button container, so a div to hold the buttons, because just looking at them they're going to have to live side by side, so I know I have to make a parent container for them. And I'm going to make sure each of them takes up about 40% of the parent container, leave some room for padding on either side. I'm going to add this image in here, so I can rotate this because my triangle is not the way I want it to be. Just rotate 90 degrees for the play button. And I'm also going to click this filter. I'm going to actually invert this because it's also white. I can easily go to Figma and make the orientation to the right with the black arrow, but just a little trick in case. It doesn't work with all colors, obviously, but if I want to switch this from white to black, I can just invert a filter on top of it. I'm going to add some text in our button. I added some border radius. Make this flex align in the center of its container. And I'm not using a button element because I can't manipulate them the same way with an image inside it and all this, so I used a div, and I'm creating my own button. I'll just give it a hover state. Fade the color a little bit when you hover over it. Make sure there's a pointer cursor and some transition. Now I'm going to just copy this because I want to make a similar one next to it. It's going to have some subtle different properties, so I will have to add a combo class to this, so not changing everything exactly like the other one. Alright, now I'm going to have my background video in here. So I use the background video element, and I just dragged it right into our section. And I'm going to give it absolute positioning and make sure it takes up the full width of its height and the full height and width of its parent container. And make sure that I set its parent to relative, so that's the boundary, not the body, because now it lives inside that 80VH heading. And I'm just going to upload a video here, and it takes a minute to transcode, which is good. You can still work around it, but mine's already done. And when I go here, you'll see it's already in place. Got a beautiful background, just Grey's Anatomy trailer, a little teaser. Nice. Give this a z-index just to make sure it lives behind the content, so because the content is more important, obviously. And I want to make my nav bar z-index higher, so that way it always lives on top, and that nav bar is fixed to the top of the page there. You'll see everything's hovering nicely. We got our Anthony div back in place. Alright, next thing we want to do is add the featured section for the Netflix shows, so those tall sort of banners. I'm going to add another section and a container. I'll add a little combo class to this container just in case we make changes to this container. It doesn't affect our homepage container as well. Heading just to indicate the section title. And now I'm going to create another container for the divs inside because I want them to be flexed. And I'm not flexing the parent because I need the only on Netflix text to sit on top, but in this container, they're going to live side by side. So it's all boxes and boxes. And in here, I'm going to create an individual item. I want that to be 20% width, just like on the home page, because there's going to be 5 of them, and that'll be 100%, 5 times 20. So I give that boundary now, so they'll all be even. And I'll give this a background image. I will put lovely Moira, Schitt's Creek, great show, hilarious show. It was the quarantine show everybody watched, I feel like. So that background image is there. I'm also adding a background gradient on top. One of my favorite things to do. It always makes things nice. Add like a top transparent layer, and then it fades into a darker color in the bottom. And that way it gives some darker space so we can read the logo of the show. So I'll put that image in there, and I'm going to make this 50% width of its container. And I can make this absolutely positioned because its parent is relative, and that way it can float it around inside its relative container anywhere I want. So I'm putting it in the bottom and the middle. And it has left and right margin of auto, so that way it centers it. Nice trick with absolute things. Here we go, it sits right in the bottom. And now I'm going to add another div on top of this. I'm going to make this the full 100% width and height. This is going to be the background video that overlays it. So I'm basically just giving it the same dimensions. It's going to sit inside of it. And I'm going to fill this background video to take up the full dimensions. And then have this little div block absolutely on the bottom of that little video, because that's going to be the text for the show and the seasons and all that. So the one people will see is the one of Moira, but then there's an invisible one on top of it. They're just absolutely positioned on top of each other, and I'll just affect the opacity on hover, so that way when the user hovers on it, it'll appear. But technically it's there the whole time. So this little text container, I'm just adding some padding to get a head start on the content we're adding. So the show title will live there. And I'm going to add a div block because it's going to contain 3 items side by side. First item is just some text. It's going to have the word new. And then I'm going to add another div block because I have this TVMA, and that's going to look like it's in a box. So I'm going to make the div block have that white border, and then inside that will live just the TVMA text itself. And then when I make the container of this flex, they'll push side by side. There we go. Add some margin. And then the last text will just be the season amount. Fix some spacing issues. And then I can text align that in the center of its parent box. Boom. There we go. Always satisfying when they line up like that. So now I'm just going to move the opacity down, because you'll see when I move back and forth, it's just right on top of it. So I'll make the starting opacity 0, and then on hover, when somebody hovers on that div, the opacity will just rise to 100. Just go down here, change that up, and then you'll see the background video and the text appear right away. Just make sure there's a smooth transition on this with the pointer so they know they can kind of interact with it. Nice. So let's check this out in action. Click to our site, and we hover over it. There we go. Nice. More of it fades out. It's a little harsh though, so let's change the time on that. Just change this to about 500 milliseconds. And now that's much more smooth and less harsh. So there we go. So it's just 2 divs on top of each other. One fades out when you hover, or one fades up when you hover over it. All right, so I just copied the one we just did of Schitt's Creek. It's the same exact formatting, but just to save time, I'll skip ahead. So I made one for the other 4 shows, and I just changed out the specifics. And they all have the background videos that are specific to the show. Nice. I'm going to take this container and I'm going to move it up a little ways, and you'll see how I've had this like faded video background in this section. I want to do the same thing because right now the background video is just a harsh cut into the next section below it. So I'm going to add a gradient on top. Remember I said I love doing this. So I'll affect our background video section. I'm going to give it a gradient background of transparent into black, so that way it fades nicely into our body section beneath. And then I moved up the container a little bit to add some overlapping. There we go. Definitely a smoother transition when someone's scrolling downwards. All right, let's work on this next section here. This is going to be the slider carousel. So here's the finished version. You'll see these boxes with the buttons inside. So I'm just going to add another section. Again, for SEO purposes, not that this is being tracked and this is an important website, but nice to use section breaks so then screen readers know that this is a new chunk of content that we're looking at. I will add this heading back in here, same styling as before. So now I'm going to add this slider element here, nice feature of Webflow. And this is what we're going to build out our little show hover divs. I'm just going to set this background transparent so we can see this. And we'll see here inside the mask, there's 2 slides created for us, and you can delete one because we're going to build one out and then just copy it. So I've got 1 slide created. I'm going to set some height and width on this. Give this a background so we can see what we're doing. So I'm going to make this relative because things are going to live inside it. And I'm going to put a div in here first, and that's going to have our content beneath it. The little black section with the buttons and everything. So I'll just give it a height of 40%, position it absolutely inside of its relative container to the bottom, give it that black background, and then I can give the main div this show background. So there it is. You'll see how most of it's the show, and then that little 40% is the black with the content inside of it. That's what we're doing here. Let's see, I think I just forgot to add a div here. I'm gonna need one more div inside here. I'm gonna reverse this. So we got our slide, then it's going to be the full div, and then the 40% div. And the reason for this we'll see later. It has to be absolutely positioned, the whole thing, because when you hover over it, it kind of grows from the center of itself, because we're going to have that scaling effect. So instead of it growing, like picture the top left corner staying where it is and then growing to the bottom right, because that's how most things would naturally grow, along an axis. But if we have this absolutely positioned, then it'll grow from the center of itself, which looks more natural. So I got that background image back in place, putting this content div where it needs to be. And then inside that div, I'll just have 2 smaller divs, each taking up 50% of its parent container. So that way I have 2 kind of narrow rectangles. One's going to hold the buttons and the other one's going to hold the text. And to create these little buttons, I'm just going to add a div square with set height and width, and then make the radius 50%. Make it a circle. And then I'll add an image inside there and the different icons. And then I'll just make sure the circle's flexed so the image sits right in the middle there. They're all going to have pretty similar styling, so I'll just kind of skip through. Cool. And we also want to have a little hover effect on these. So when you hover over it, the background changes to gray. And since they all have the same class applied to those circle divs, they will all absorb that styling. And now this last little chunk on the bottom, again, it's similar to what we did above. It's just going to be the new, or the 96% match in the green, the TVMA div with the text inside of it, and then the seasons next to it. And then we'll just flex align center for that. And this one's not perfect. You can play with the spacing and the sizing of these if you're recreating it, and now we want to have it grow like that. You see how it's growing from the center like I was mentioning? So we want to add an interaction. So we're going to affect the main div itself, the outermost parent. And on hover, we're going to add this interaction. I'm just going to scale it ever so slightly. And tricks about scaling I recently learned, it's so silly, but 1.1 is kind of you think 1 and then 1.1 is the next option you have. And sometimes that's still a little drastic for me. So I finally realized you could do 1.01, 1.02. You can find all the smaller values in between if you just want really subtle hover effects. Definitely useful if you don't want to do anything too dramatic. So for this, just doing something subtle, it's just going to grow a little bit. And I also want to change the size of it because I want it to kind of expand downwards slightly just so we have more room to read the content that's beneath. So I'm just going to add 50 pixels to the height when they hover over it as well. And that whole div on the bottom, the black div with the content, I'm fading the opacity in for that. So initially you can't see it, but then when they hover over it, it's in view. Here we go. And then we know the drill for this. On hover out, you're just going to duplicate it what you just did, delete some of the values, so it does the reverse when you hover off of it. All right, we can highlight all those and affect the duration and the easing for all of them at the same time. And then we check this out. There it is, our beautiful Grey's Anatomy. The buttons hover work. Nice, so we got 1 slide created, and now, best part, copy, paste, copy, paste, copy, paste. So we put that all inside of our mask, because that's what holds all of our slides. And then just add some margin to separate these. First I'm actually going to affect some overflow properties. I'm going to target the main container here and make sure the overflow is hidden. First I noticed that I had this 100 VH, change that to 100% of the height instead. And now, perfect, nothing's collapsing. But just in case we don't have a horizontal scroll bar, which is kind of a no-no in web design, make sure that overflow is set to hidden for our container, just in case. Add some margin on the left here, because we don't want the user to use their mouse to be able to just scroll left and right. We just want them to have to click on the slider bar itself. And now we don't want a million Grey's Anatomies. This is what I was going to say before, so we can just change the styling of these. Just add a combo class for the show that you're adding, and then you can change the background image. If you don't add a combo class and you change one of the backgrounds, they will all change to that because we copied and pasted it initially. So we want to make sure they each have their own unique show attached. Let's get rid of the height a little bit. Let's make this, affect the slider height, shrink this down. You can change out these titles to be more specific and add some different sections. And when we preview this, we'll see here, they grow, but they're kind of disappearing a little bit. They're being cut off, right? So this is because of the overflow property on one of the containers. I think it's on the mask. So if we go to our mask and see that's set to hidden, we change the overflow to visible, and that way it's not going to chop off anything that grows beyond the boundaries of the mask. So now these slides will grow past the masks. Great. And now we see here when we load the page, it's kind of harsh, but on the finished version we have this nice Netflix transition. I'll show you how to do that little simple animation that will nicely bring you into the site. So similar to the two big divs that we had before, I'm going to create another one that's going to be our sort of loading screen overlay. So I'm going to make another div, absolutely positioned, that takes up the full width of the screen. And I'll give this a big black background. And make sure the z-index is higher than everything else, so just set it to something big like 1,000. Great, and I head over to Lottie Files, great resource if you're not familiar. It's like little GIFs and animations. I searched for Netflix and somebody created this lovely animation, perfect for what I needed. So I downloaded that file, and now you added a Lottie element to your document, and you can attach that. You can affect the duration. I'm going to just add looping, so that way it doesn't just play once and disappear. In case someone's browser is taking a long time to load, I want it to make sure the animation loops through continuously until it's ready. So I put that in there. I'm going to flex the parent container so this lives in the middle. There we go. I made it 50% of the width. And now you'll see it lives right in the middle. Wonderful. But because we don't have anything else attached, it's just going to keep playing over and over. So we want to make sure that this whole div will disappear once the page is loaded. Because there's a lot of big content on this, so the background videos that I have and all the imagery. So some people's web browsers will take a long time to load this. So you'll see there I went to interactions and I'm adding a when page finishes loading interaction. So this is affecting the loading screen, and I'm going to have similar to what we've done with other elements. When the page finishes loading, so all those elements are brought in, all the images, all the background videos and everything, the Netflix animation will stop looping and it will fade out into the choose your profile icon screen that we made first. So first it fades away, and then the display goes to none. Remember, just in case we don't want it to disappear when it's still fading. Nice. So let's publish this so we can see all of our stuff in action. And when we take a look, we'll see our Netflix comes in, but then the page loaded pretty quickly, so it cut off. So we don't really want that. We want this just in case people's browsers are slow, but if they're too fast, we also want them to see the whole interaction, right? So right there, I added a delay, 4-second delay to our opacity. That kind of ensures that the Netflix loop will play at least once. So when we refresh this, we got a nice 4-second delay, even though the page might be loaded already. It at least will fade away and bring us into our screen. And look, we have everything in place. Our nav bar, our notification dropdown, that red dot disappears once we've hovered over this. We've got our profiles to choose from. We've got our background video and buttons. We've got our featured background videos for the only on Netflix shows. And we've got our big carousels. This is the finished one where I went ahead and changed all the shows out. And you can scroll through. Got the hover effects applied. Pretty unique, right? pretty cool. This was really fun to make. Thanks for hanging in there. Congratulations if you made it to the end of this video. Gold stars for you. Let me know if you got any value out of this or you learned anything from it. I hope you did. If it was too fast or you missed some parts, feel free to rewatch it or head over to the link below. You can clone the Webflow project and look out some specifics and things if you need to see how things were actually made. Let me know if you would have done anything differently. I'm always looking for new ways to learn and approach things and break some old habits that I might have. But go build something cool. I will see you in the next video.